Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are about 9 o'clock. The doors are going to be remain open, and I'm sure we'll be joined by some other guests as we get started here. We have, it looks like 2 to 3 dozen people online joining us with Teams today. So we will remember to pause periodically to make sure they've got questions or whatnot to interact with the group that's here. So I want to introduce myself. My name is Ben Carpenter. I'm the chairman of the House Legislative Budget and Audit Committee who's hosting this training session. The Alaska Oil and Gas Association has been great to help us with the connecting us with the subject matter experts here. And I want to introduce Rich and Christina, a father-daughter trio or a duo here. Combined, I think they've got 50 years of oil and gas experience, not only in Alaska and all over the world. So I don't want to take a whole lot of time and giving out a big introduction on those individuals. They can speak for themselves much better than I can. So I want to turn it over to you. Are we working online? Good. Sounds working.
I think so.
Can we get confirmation that the online can hear us fine before we begin? Okay, we're doing good. I will hand the mic over to Rich. One wants it.
We're mic.
And we'll get started. Oh, you've got mics going. So
mic.
I will hold the mic out here, and if there are questions, we'll pass the mic so that everybody online can hear.
That's great.
All right, we'll get started.
Good morning, everybody. As I had somebody who asked us, are we like the bad penny that just keeps coming back? And I said, no, Alaska's sort of like our adopted is you see them growing up, but there's still holes that they run into. So what come back and try and help out. But for those that listen, the number of new faces, as Roger just said, we've got a career that spans several decades. And personally, we've worked for governments. We've worked for the Saudis. We've worked for the Kuwaitis, Indonesia, Australia, Brunei, all the big producers, Venezuela. I've had the great distinction in my old career of living through 3 attempted coups in foreign countries. So it gets very interesting. As she got a phone call once that said, you're going to see things on TV, but don't worry, I've got myself to safety. And then they got to watch it all happen on TV unfold in this country. And, I was there in the middle of it. So I've seen revolutions over oil and gas in other countries. And the most amazing one was in Venezuela when PDVSA was sort of run out of town and about 100,000 people surrounded the building. It was very interesting trying to get out of there. But that's the work for governments in many different places. We've seen a number of things that have gone on. And we recently, our biggest recent project is we worked as expert witnesses on petroleum contracts and petroleum legislation. It was a $4 billion plus difference of and the good news is we ended up, our side didn't pay the 4, they only had to pay about 900, but we call ourselves victorious. And we were the only experts. It was a very interesting thing that there was that much, but on our side, we had accounting experts and us. But in doing that, what we were able to do is we were able to bring our experience of all the different places we've been, what's normal, what's not normal, what can be done, what can't be done, and then how to do all the very detailed economic modeling. So we've had some fun, but in the middle of that, somebody said, Lord, well, you're not very published. Our expert's published. He's got 48 articles. He's got 6 books. He's got whatever. And I said, no, I don't worry about publications. My publications are called Laws in 6 countries, the Regulations in 12, and the Petroleum Sharing Contracts in 3, that they're still in place today and being used. So that's the experience that we bring to the table. Christina worked with me a lot on that. So I'll let her introduce herself.
Morning. I am Christina, and as introduced, I'm Rich's daughter. We've had a few times in the past where people have confused us for spouses, so good going for Rich. But no, I am Rich's daughter. I grew up an oil and gas baby, and I went into the industry in 2007. So I worked for a while in a midstream construction project. I think a lot of people, if you know oil and gas history, you know about Beaumont, Texas, east of Houston. So that's where I started laying pipe and working on big compressor stations, meter stations there. I worked in consulting for a few years. Rich's experience, he has a lot in the Middle East, and I have a lot in Latin America and in Mexico. And then I worked at a major oil services company doing petroleum economics, profit maximization, working with the executive team on the Latin American business, and then jumped back over into consulting. So I have done both on the ground work, sitting in the high office work, and then also consulting and the government work on the policy side and on the litigation and arbitration side. So we started coming up here, or I started coming up here in 2016, but started actually working on Alaska policy in 2010. So one thing that we'd like to say is, like Rich said, we've continually come up here and we've come up under different contracts. This material, we have definitely familiar faces in the room. And so if you have attended this before, you have seen a good amount of this material, because when it comes to components of fiscal policies around the world, although we have new ones that pop up and we have new trends that pop up, how those mechanisms work is the same. And what we have changed over the years is the contemporary market and business we're working in. So for example, when we first developed this material a few years back, the energy transition wasn't as big of a topic and wasn't so prevalent. And now obviously that is a prevalent day-to-day topic, and it disproportionately affects Alaska over other regimes like the lower 48 that you may look at. So we are going to talk about that a bit, but you will see familiar information. Rich and I like to have very interactive classes. So if you have commentary from your own experience, you have questions, anything like that, and that goes for everyone online as well. I think we have someone monitoring the chat box there. So anything that you guys would like to add, please jump in, please raise your hand, interrupt us. We won't probably remember very many names. So if you guys, when you ask a question, could just introduce yourselves and say whose office you're with, or if you're a member of the legislature, that would be great.
Okay.
Mm.
Either way. Okay, that's better. Just took a little second. But now, since like church, everybody went to the back, that means as a preacher, I'm going to come and talk into the audience, so that way I can see you and see the whites of your eyes and when I always go forward. One of the things we always like to do, we got here, is what do you want to know? We've sort of given training about 6 times now in either Juneau or Anchorage. And so this is for your benefit. We're not here for our benefit. You know, they pulled me off a cruise ship and got me off my vacation to come in here, because as soon as my wife retired, we've been on the road enjoying things. But what we really want to know is, what do you each want to get out of these 2 days and the part of these 2 days that you're here? If there's something very particular, just let us know what it is. If it's something general, we're interested in that as well, because what that does is I can teach this 100 different ways. The amount of material that we've got, we're skimming at a very high level, and where necessary, based on your questions, we can dive in and give a little color commentary, so that way you can better understand what there is. So let's start with our sponsor. What would you like to know or know more about?
Thanks, Rich. This is Representative Carpenter. One of the things that I want to know, and I think I caught one of the sessions that you taught back in 2019, I think it was. Our tax policy is pretty complex in the state, and I would like to know whether we're doing things the right way that is maximizing both revenue to the state and incentive for developing the oil and gas industry within the state, meaning economic activity within the state. That's a fairly general question, but I just want to know whether there are things that we could be doing better to approach both of those areas.
Okay, good. Anyone else? I'm gonna have to pick on people. Elise?
Let's see. So to start with, I haven't been to one of these before, so I don't know what I'm already going to get. And so that's important. But I think it's critical for us to, I think, really learn more about the transitioning phase and how that maybe has us looking at oil and gas taxes differently with respect to um, making a plan. Are we getting the most we can from without turning away any business in these times? I don't know about how it looks on an global market in terms of new companies coming in. I'm hearing a lot of new projects coming up. Be interesting to know if changes looking after that would be distracting or hurtful to new companies.
Hurtful, harmful.
And then lastly, I'm always curious to know how certain are you with what you're providing? Because my tiny little experience in finance taught me that every day the mood changed in the room depending on the price of oil. And the price of oil, of course, was entirely unpredictable. So if you could also give us a sense of your certainty in terms of what offering on these bits and pieces, that would be great too.
Perfect.
Thank you for saying that this is, this material is largely new to you, because that's helpful to us as well. Like Rich said, knowing, how to also, I think that you will be a great test for us as we go through this. Raise your hand and say, you're making no sense, slow down. So that'll be, I think, to the room.
And let me just feel for those that might have been to some of our training before, Elise brings up a great question. Before, when we talked, you might have had 4 or 5 possible pathways you could take as a state. And if I used my arm and my hand, they all kind of ended up in the same spot, just a little bit different. Now I think your decision is this wide. It's either over here, far to the left, or it's over here, far to the right, meaning I'm going to take a fork. It's either, do I go into harvest mode because ban fossil fuels is going to kick up steam, they're going to shut it down. So now how do I operate as a state in harvest mode? Or am I a believer, as I am personally, we're 3-4 decades away from peak oil, and Alaska's got the resources. It ought to be doing everything to get those online and get the revenue from that and bank it. So when we do get to ban fossil fuels, you've got the money in the bank to be able to run the state. That was a good question.
Hi there, Representative Donna Mears from South Muldoon and East Anchorage. I want to echo Representative Carpenter and Representative Galvin. Absolutely, that balance and where that can be between public and private benefit, but also looking at energy transition. And it's not just what we're producing, but it's also the global demand is shifting towards more renewables, towards decarbonization, and kind of getting every time I hear layering on more information and putting things into perspective about the choices that we can make and what real options are for Alaska. So it's all going in, and more data, more better. So thank you.
Okay.
Hi, this is Representative Johnson, and I have a couple questions and thoughts. First of all, I agree with you on the peak oil. I think that's a long ways off, because even though the energy pie is growing, it grows, but it doesn't mean that there's less. It just means that we're going to use more and more and more energy, in my opinion. But one of the things, and I've been through the training a number of times, but what I was wondering is if you would go over, so we have a number of changes since the last time that I heard your presentation, and one of those things is we've had BP out and Hillcorp in, and they have a different tax structure. I mean, they have a different corporate structure. And then as we bring Willow online, there is some concern about ring fencing and and I think some of that's been addressed. I'm not entirely certain, but whether Conoco could attribute their construction to all their other fields, leaving Alaska with basically a huge gap in income. That's some of the future, just actual tax structure issues that I would like to see if you could address. I mean, I know that I want to hear a lot more about, just the overall piece, but as you're speaking to it, if you would address a couple of those pieces that I have heard incomplete. I feel like incomplete information, or I personally have an incomplete understanding of that.
Okay, thank you. Try it. Anything else online in the room? Oh, quiet crowd. Oh, we have one more here.
Pete Eklund, I work for Senator Stedman. I'm curious about, and I've seen you many times, so this is a good refresher for me. Curious about, we have, we have royalties and we have severance taxes. I'm curious if other jurisdictions, and we have varying patches, and we're getting farther and farther away where we maybe don't have the same royalty as on state land. Do other jurisdictions offer the same severance tax on varying royalty structures they have?
Okay. Yeah, when we get into kind of where Alaska fits and the different tools that are out there that others use, we'll talk about that. Anything else? All right, so before I let Christina kick off, I'm just gonna give one more story. You'll find I'm a big storyteller, and I kind of bring some of the things that I've done in my career on this. But ever since we found out we're gonna come up here and train, been on a few trips. One of those was 3 weeks. It was an Alaska land tour. I brought my brother and his wife and some friends to your great state and did a tour all the way around. And it got to where my wife and my brother just ignored me, because everybody we met, whether it was at the bar, in the hot tub, by the pool, having dinner, or it was our guide or the hotel receptionist or the people I asked about, what's your thoughts about oil companies in Alaska? Are they paying enough? Are they paying their fair share? What's your thoughts on PFD? What do you think should be done, and how it should be going? What do you think is going to happen to Alaska? If things come in and, oil is shut down quicker rather than later, what do you think that means for Alaska? But I also talked to people who weren't from Alaska. I talked to all the people that I could tell, were professionals. I found out some were lawyers, doctors, business owners, and I asked them about things generally around the U.S. And so I was able to get a lot of, call it focus group opinion going forward. But I had the most interesting question I'm going to ask this class, and there's one person who I've told the answer to, so they can't answer. Okay. Here believe that fracking started plus or minus 2000 to 2010. Okay. Nope. How many think it started after 2010? 90 in the 90s? Show of hands. Nobody? 80s? 70s? I got a few in the 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s. Okay, I've only seen half the class go up. Everybody I surveyed on my informal focus groups said fracking started, 100% of them said fracking started somewhere between 2000 and 2010. That's where I started. And probably talked to 40 different people. And then they would say fracking's bad. And I'd say, why is fracking bad? Chemicals, and it gets into the water, fresh drinking water. I said, okay, so that's why you're against it. I said, I wonder if you realize that fracking on a scale basis in the oil patch started in the 1950s. And in fact, the Hugoton gas field, which spans about 150 miles north and south, 50 miles east and west, and covers southwest Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas Panhandle, served 80% of the natural gas needs of this country for almost 3 decades. And every one of those wells was massively fracked in the 1950s. And I refracked 1,000 of them in the 1980s with massive fracks. Well, there were a couple, but we've proven they weren't the reason why. But not a single concern over fresh water, not a single concern of gas coming out of faucets, not a single concern over earthquakes. And the fracks that we did back in the 50s and the 80s are bigger than the fracks we're doing now. So what you're going to hear a lot from me is I've become sort of a passionate now in my retirement about all the misinformation that's out there. And the reason why we do this training is I'll try and keep personal opinion out, but what I want to do is bring the facts of the industry to you. So that way, when you're out talking to your constituents or you're out talking to others about what's going on, you're able to come at it from a position of facts and knowledge, or at least, and if you don't have it right at hand, where to kind of go and get that. So that way you can have the discussion based on what's actually happening. Because I said, if there's nothing else, there's one thing we know about every industry, and it's not just the oil industry, but every industry gets better and safer as time goes on. They learn from past mistakes. So you would think that by the time we were hitting the 50th anniversary of fracking, that they were safer and better than they were in the 50s and 60s being performed. So why all of a sudden we got problems? Are they real problems or made up problems? I leave that kind of for you guys to answer, but we'll get going now with.
Lauren, what time are we going till this morning? Noon? Okay. All right. Just wanted to check time. Okay, so we have already gone through what we hope to learn. You know who we are. This is a big message that we share each time we speak, really. And that's that the oil industry, oil and gas industry is always changing. So if you hear all the stories, you know, from Rich, like one that he just shared from his career, you hear the ones from my career, there's constant ups and downs. Representative Galvin just talked about how oil price is volatile. So that in itself inherently causes the industry to be continually changing. We'll go through some of the global connections and talk about the global market and how interconnected it is. And I think today with the internet and everything else, we say we're more connected than ever, but the oil and gas industry has always been connected. Those who supply oil are not always the same ones that consume it. Same thing for gas. Those that supply aren't always consuming. Globally, we are largely all consumers, but we are not all suppliers. So that in itself connects everything. Like Rich said, we are continually innovating. Technology is continually, you know, moving forward. When I worked at a service company, I worked in the same building. I was not myself in research, but I worked in that building. So we would get notifications, hey, just so you know, this test is going on. Tomorrow you may hear loud booms and feel big pressure because they were doing, you know, all the research to be able to drill deeper in the Gulf of Mexico. So they were doing all the pressure testing, all the temperature testing. So these things are constantly ongoing in the industry, and we're constantly seeing that change. So if we rope this into why does this matter for policy, policy is a continual year after year discussion because the world is changing, the market is changing, and what the state of Alaska needs also could change. Depending on what the state needs at the time, this is an ongoing discussion. So I know that stability is talked about a lot, but something that Rich and I will share today is that part of stability is this being a continued discussion. So framing our whole discussion of the day, fiscal policy entails two parties. Fiscal policy entails the government, that is you guys, and it entails the oil companies. And what you're working to do in this balance is you have governments who need to steward their resource, who need revenue to, you know, run their jurisdictions. And then you have the oil and gas companies that in many places around the world, they don't own the resources, but they are bringing the people, the technology, everything else to be able to develop those resources on behalf of the state or the country. And so a fiscal policy, just like any other, you know, any other business, has to benefit both sides. And those drivers are different. What a government needs is different from what company needs, but both sides are trying to maximize their return, right? And so that's our whole frame for today.
It's probably a good time to bring up something that we get asked a lot. How does Alaska compare? And
Oh, it fell off.
I stepped on it. That's why it's not working. You know, how does Alaska compare? And you're not alone in that. Every government I work for always asks, how do we compare? The one thing I've learned is when you're looking to compare governments, not only look at their fiscal policy, but look at what drives their fiscal policy. Some countries that are huge net importers overall, or have economies that are at the young stage, really develop their whole policy around what they charge for development in their country, around building industry, around bringing energy just to the masses. So that way they can have light and they can have heat and they can, have all the nice things that a modern society has. So their approach to what their fiscal terms are is going to be very different to, say, the Saudis, who, when they opened up to Western investment, what their terms were, because they were very self-sufficient. They already had all their oil. They knew what they were doing. They just wanted some additional capital coming in. So their approach to what terms they offered and how they offered are very different than other countries. And there's one thing that we'll talk about later, not in detail, but there's something called local market. A lot of countries in the basic contract is you'll be obligated to sell a large portion of the oil and gas that you produce to local markets at discounted prices, kind of an indirect taxation. Okay. There's not a single consultant, when they give you their chart of here's Alaska's tax rate compared to all the other tax rates, that local market indirect tax is never built into that table. And so we'll get into later and talking about, if you want to go out and you want to find out how Alaska compares, we're going to, I want to do is help you ask the questions. I want you to put every consultant that comes in front of you, including us, as we used to, you ask the good, intelligent, tough questions and force them to actually give you the type of information that you need, not the type of information they pull off the shelf and present you.
Okay, and talking about the two parties, I think in the state when bills come before you or you're looking at tax policy, these things on the top like IRR, ROI, NPV, these are all, economics and finance terms that on the oil company side, that's how they're evaluating projects. Rich will tell you he was part of this. I was at one point that in these companies, projects globally and all different kinds of projects. So you might have short ones that get your money back fast and long ones that like Alaska and domestic ones in the US and foreign ones across the globe. And all of these projects go into the boardroom. There's an amount of money and the teams for these projects go in and they vie for their project. And they say, we've done this assessment, we've run these numbers, we've done the technology assessment, everything else. And they're asking for money for their project. And what happens is that gets evaluated. It gets evaluated on economics, on, risk, everything else. And these are the type of numbers that oil companies are looking at. They're saying on the back end of this project, what kind of money are we getting back and how much time is it going to take? So if you think about an investment that you might do in a business and you say, okay, it's going to cost me $50,000, but I'm going to get that $50,000 back in the first year, plus I'm going to make $50,000 more. You might say like, that sounds pretty good. But if you're going to make a $50,000 investment and it takes you 5 years to get your $50,000 back, and 5 years after that, you've only made 10,000 more, which project's going to win? Which one are you going to put your money into? If you and your household are talking about something to invest in, which one seems like the more sure idea? So in the state, we're looking at the fiscal policy and saying, we're talking about the revenue to the state and how much tax revenue and how much royalty and, what are we looking at as far as credits go or anything else like that. And they talk about it in a different way. So what we want to do today also is kind of show you that other side so that as you guys are looking at different bills and you're looking at your policy, you can understand the other side of the table. You can understand sort of, if you want to call it your partner in developing your resource, or you want to call it the guy on the other side of the table you're negotiating with.
Can we just go back? I just
Mhm.
want to emphasize, because you didn't specifically talk about it, I'm going to, is, there's the obvious, if something economic, is there enough oil and gas? Is the price the right price? But the one thing that don't really always understand is the time value. And we're going to go over that a couple times, but it's the timing, as Christina just kind of gave up. It's not just whether it's a short project or a large project, it's the timing. When does the cash go in and when does the cash come back out to the oil company? We're going to have a slide to show you. I can take the same amount of cash and I move it around and call it different fiscal systems. And I can go from a highly desirable project as a producer to a highly undesirable project as a producer. But there was also something else that came in between sort of 2010 and just pre-COVID. And that was the money that came into the oil industry started coming in from private equity. That changed the dynamics of the oil companies, especially in the lower 48. Because what was the most important thing to the private equity? And we got somebody in the back shaking his head who worked for them. It's time. They wanted their money back quickly. So oil companies were doing things because they would, if I remember the number, it was something like in just the period 2011 to 2014, $189 billion came in from private equity to small, mid-sized oil companies in the US. They don't wait 15 years for their money back. That's not their investors' MO. That's not their MO. They want it back in 2-3 years. And I'll just tell again an anecdote because I'm the storyteller. I had a good friend who went to work as a CFO for a mid-sized company, and they got $500,000 funding from private equity. And in 6 months, he quit. And why did he quit? Well, there was the analyst at the private equity were calling him up on Friday night when he was at dinner saying, you were supposed to drill 182 feet today with that bit, and you only got 179. What's going on? Are you on them out there? Are we going to get the 182 feet? And he'd say, that's just normal. We don't know exactly what we're going to run into. We have a great estimate. So the whole reason I'm bringing this story up is you can find the personality of the oil company that you're dealing with change. And as we talk about the transition away from fossil fuels, the source of the money is going to be a big issue for oil companies, especially those coming to the Arctic. And so you're going to see more and more of decision making driven by the source of their capital to do the investment. And so just kind of keep in mind, it's not going to be the way it was 10, 15 years ago. It's going to be very different today.
So we have these questions up at the top, and we're going to do like a little show of hands fun here. So in the state, I know that there is a fair share discussion, and we've all heard that. But how many people have been part of a discussion that they say, how much can we tax the oil companies, and are they going to leave? Or how much can we tax them and enough that we get more money, but they don't leave? Show of hands. Right. Second question, how do we compare to other places the oil companies can invest? I already had 3 conversations about this just this morning, before the session started. And one of the things that I said is, yes, look outward and see how you compare, but Alaska is unique. And each regime around the world is unique because their drivers are very specific. So some of those can be drivers, industry drivers, like do we need to attract new players? If so, incentivize new players coming to the state. Do we need to attract more production? If so, incentivize new production. But on the flip side of that, and this isn't as common in the US as it is globally, but companies globally, sometimes they need new schools built. So they will incentivize and do credits or deductions based off of, in a contractual obligation that money is set aside for new school funding. So I think that sometimes there can be this thought of who can we look at to see what we can do and what was successful and what we can follow. But there's a whole element of looking inside and saying, what's happening in our state? What does our state need? What's our state situation? And how do we fit in the global market? And how can we fill our needs given what's going on outside? Because there's no finite list for fiscal policy that says you have to choose from this list of things and that's all you can do. The creativity is yours, like to meet your needs through your fiscal policy. And what we'll go through a lot today is, I think we look at headline tax rates and we say, this regime taxes this much, or this regime has this much royalty, they have more royalty than us. But as Rich already gave an example, a headline tax rate is tip of the iceberg. There's the whole fiscal policy and how those components work together is what's most important.
And we'll come to this again, and we'll kind of show you where it fits in the picture. But I think that the biggest thing that is forgotten is that you'll run economics. We've run economics. We've run the producer economics, okay, under the Alaska system. But that really isn't the producer economics. If you look in your legislation, there's a whole list of costs that they aren't allowed to deduct when calculating their Alaska taxes. And every regime has a few things they don't allow to be deducted when figuring out the tax in that regime. But when that oil company, when that person like me would take that project in for approval, I've got to include every cost that my company is going to incur, whether it's allowed as a deduction by that government or not. So whereas it might appear when you get someone to come in and say, analyze how this project looks in Alaska, okay, you're not actually looking at all the cost. You're looking at the costs that you allow and then comparing those same allowed costs in, say, Norway or the UK or somewhere else. I mean, I've gone back and looked at prior presentations that are done, and they take the same profile, which means they take the same costs. But that's not truly what the oil company costs are. And the differences can be quite significant in certain places. For example, one of the big ones is overhead. You know, in some regimes, if you put an office building in and you bring in a bunch of people, they love that. So they'll let you fully deduct that 100%. In other regimes, they say, nope, that's overhead. You know, you're limited to 2 or 3% of your overall cost for overhead, and that's all we're going to allow. But, you know, the regime isn't thinking about all the jobs that they bring in. So it's all the professional jobs, and then it's all the, you know, usually it's the 7 times multiplier. They say, you know, for every good manufacturing and professional job, you bring 7 support jobs, the convenience store, the grocery store, the dry cleaner, you know, the teachers, and on and on. So, you know, again, these are some of the hidden things that you don't see, but these are the things that when the oil companies do their analysis, that's what they do. And so we try and be very careful that when we put it up is this is under this tax legislation, this is what the producer takes home, but that's not the producer economics.
Do we have any questions so far? Any commentary? Anything anyone wants to add before we move on? Nope. All right. So the complexity of this industry is it has its own language, basically. There's so much technology, so many technical terms, so many economic terms. And some of these ones underneath here, you'll see that Rich and I use them interchangeably. So we may say government, we may say state. That could mean a lower 48 state, or it could just refer to a government regime in general. As far as fiscal policy goes, unfortunately, we wish-wash between all of those terms when speaking, and we tried to catch them on the slides, but who knows? And then government take, state take. As far as the oil companies go, we're calling them oil companies. They're typically oil and gas companies or producers or operators, or around the world where they operate under contracts, they're the contractor. And these days, more and more being referred to as energy companies. So we just wanted to put this list up here so that we don't cause any confusion when we kind of switch in and out.
But if we use a term and it doesn't make sense to you, or you can't make sense of what we said, raise your hand and ask. There's,
Please.
as I always said, there's no stupid questions, there's only stupid answers.
Great, thanks. So for those who are newer to the industry, I know, especially here in Alaska, it is very important, and people pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the state. So for example, let's say you see a news article that says, so-and-so oil company has drilled or has, run seismic in this area, and then it spits out a whole bunch of technical terms, and you're like, what is this article even telling me? What does it mean? A great resource is the IN3NERGY glossary. If you go in there, any word you type in, it's going to give you an explanation. So it's super, super helpful. It's something I used when I was young in my career, and I just spit everything into there. That's how I learned. So we wanted to leave this here for you guys. And one big difference, and this is very important in talking about potential in a regime, and this is very important in Alaska, is that resources and reserves are 2 very different values. And if we take it to, I mean, Rich can go through the technical side of it, but if we take it to a very basic level, resources when you see that in a news article, resources is something that you know is down there. You've determined it's down there. And when we talk about reserves, that's talking about what can technically be recovered and economically be recovered. So that's something that, you know, goes to the boardroom, has a plan.
Yeah.
Resources, for example, a long time ago, we may have known something was in the ground, but we didn't have the technology to drill that deep, or it was too expensive to drill that deep, and that project would never go through. So if we take it on an easy level, that's the explanation, but technical man.
Yeah, and one additional piece for a reserve, for a resource to become a reserve, it has to have a company approved project. So I may have this, let's take Willow, for example. Willow sat out there as resources. And not until all the approvals are in place and Conoco board approves the project, does it become a reserve. So that wasn't a reserve on their books, that was a resource on their books. And so what you'll see is, you'll see people misuse this term all the time. You know, one of the others, like coming up here, I tried to re-educate myself in a hurry on a lot of things. And some great experts said, it doesn't matter whether we stop and ban fossil fuels. Based on our current reserves, we run out in 33 years. Our current reserves, not our current resources. They said we only have 40 years worth of gas. Well, the one thing we know from shale, that if you take all the mathematics and all the engineering and all the geological aspects of it, the United States has 500 years worth of gas as resources. It'll become a reserve when they actually approve to go out and drill the well. So don't get lost in this, all this commentary about things based on the number of reserves we have. That's just what's been approved and what's being drilled. We have huge resources, as does a lot of places in the world. So we're not running out of fossil fuels anytime soon.
And this is something that's important in the energy transition talk, right? Because Alaska is a place with vast, vast, vast resources. So when we're looking at those pathways, like Rich talked about, there's going to be a demand for decades. Is Alaska the place? Because companies can come here, invest heavily, but produce for decades. Is Alaska then the place that should say, hey, we're going to fill that pipeline. We're going to fill that demand. Those barrels are coming from us because of the type of resources that we know exist here. And another point there is that this isn't something that's just decided by the companies. This is something here that's regulated by the SEC. So when I was in consulting, I used to work half the year in Colombia for Ecopetrol, and well, not in there, but you spent half my year working their project. And I did the reserves the field economics on every single one of, well, on a third of their fields. Because this is a heavily regulated number. This isn't something people get to sort of arbitrarily define on their own. Okay. I think we already covered this, that really we're talking about an industry that has evolved through technology, innovation that's constantly changing. And so that's why we're here to have this discussion today. So what we're going to go through is just a sort of quick crash course on what is a hydrocarbon, and where are they sort of in our existence and in our daily existence. We used to have a graphic that had like dinosaurs in the ground and all kinds of stuff, like to explain where hydrocarbons came from. But basically, hydrocarbon, it's an organic compound. And when we talk about hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, we're really, talking about crude, coal, and natural gas, and something that is not widely known. And, I think people consider Texas like a very pro-oil state, and, the cowboy hats and the drilling rigs and everything. But even at home, and I spend a lot of time around high school teenagers, and I have a bunch of them ask me, like, isn't it just going to go away? Like, aren't we just going to wind and going to solar? And I tell them, like, where do you think your shoes came from? Where do you think your cell phone came from? Where do you think the car you just drove up to my house came from? And they all look at me like, hmm? And so I think something that is lost in this discussion, we're going to talk about this more, is that yes, we may start with a barrel of oil, or we may start with gas. However, all the byproducts from that after it's refined is what we use in our modern day living. And here we go. So all the talk right now about the energy transition, absolutely, it's valid. Absolutely, we are looking for different sources of energy. However, we talk about it a lot from the power and transportation sector. We don't talk about it from, who knows somebody or who has had surgery in the past year. Everything in an OR, if you've had to have an IV, which I do triathlon, so I'm an IV regular. If you've had to have an IV, that bag and that drip kit and everything is coming from byproducts of oil and gas. So can we address power generation? Can we address transportation? We're doing that. Do we have the technology to replace artificial joints and to replace things in an OR, to replace our cell phones or our laptops, which we all completely rely on? No, we don't have that yet. And so there is a demand that is coming from that, that we don't have the technology to replace, and that is not a quick process to develop that and manufacture it and make it affordable to consumers.
And, we'll acknowledge that in all aspects of industry, people are trying to find alternatives. In fact, 5, 6 years ago, Japanese and Korean car makers trying to find an alternative to the rubber and the plastic that insulates wires. I mean, cars are nothing but a bunch of wires, and you got to insulate them. And they went to a soy-based insulator. Guess what happened after that? Car after car ended up in the repair shop because the mice and the squirrels and the rats and everything ate the insulation.
You can look at it on Google.
You can go Google it and you'll find it.
Funny.
Now, in the beginning, the auto manufacturer said, oh, it had nothing to do. Mice eat wires all the time anyway. But there was an abnormally high incident rate of the cars that had soy-based insulation that had the problem with the varmints going and eating through the cables and basically disabling the vehicle. So, they're going to be looking for alternatives. I think, and the point is we do need to look for alternatives. What you have to look at as Alaska is, when do you think those alternatives will be ready? Because until those alternatives are ready, everything that we do now that is oil and gas based is going to have to remain oil and gas based until it comes out. And just one last anecdote, when I was looking all this up, I just realized something, that actually the advent of en masse electricity came at the same time that oil and petrochemicals were discovered. So electricity, wires, and plastic insulation and the rest have always gone hand in hand from the beginning. So we've never had a period to go back and say, well, what did we do before? We didn't have a before. We only have the current, which has been the current for over 100 years.
So how do these get created? Basically, it's organic material that for hundreds of millions of years, after these things decompose, we get these deposits of oil and gas. And why does this matter when we're discussing fiscal policy? Number one, these resources are finite, so you develop them once. You have now disturbed and changed that area. And you have also, once that barrel is produced, it's gone. There's hundreds of millions of years from now, maybe we'll have some more, but it's not filling back up anytime soon. When we talk about reserves and resources in the state, while we are continually finding more through technology, what you have is what you have. And also, we're going to talk on the next few slides about how oil and gas varies globally in different deposits and can even vary in a very small region, of a state. And those different deposits come with different cost structures to produce, and they come with different prices on the back end of what they're worth in the market. So what determines that worth in the market? Crude is really looked at on two scales. One is on API gravity, and that basically means, does it flow like water, does it flow like applesauce, or does it flow like peanut butter? And that's the number that you're looking at. So think of that in terms of cost structure in petroleum economics, in terms of how much does it cost to put in infrastructure to move these materials. Water and applesauce are going to move a lot better than peanut butter. You have to treat the peanut butter to get that to move. And then on the refining side, same thing. You have to refine those peanut butter products more to get it into a usable consumer form. And then the other scale is off of sulfur content. And so that gets called sweet or sour, and the sweeter means the lower sulfur content, sour means higher. So again, you run into the same thing. Something has a high sulfur content, that's where you start to see corrosion, things like that. So it's a more expensive treatment, and it's a more expensive movement.
What does sulfur and water make? Sulfuric acid. So that's why you really worry about that. One thing that we didn't really bring out, it kind of gets into, but refineries. People have always said, like West Texas, why, if the U.S. why the U.S. keeps importing, but it's exporting West Texas oil? Well, West Texas oil is a very high API, very much like baby oil. But the refineries in the U.S. were set up to refine Middle East crude. So West Texas can get to the 55 to 60 API. Market crude's around 31 API. And refineries, you can't just turn a dial and then have them handle 50 API, or turn a dial and have them 10. They're designed for a very narrow range. I think if you go read, because they believe West Texas will be there, Exxon's actually spending a lot of money updating a refinery to be able to handle the West Texas crude so we don't export it. But they have to do a total massive redo on the refinery to be able to handle it. So the API gravity of crude becomes very, very important. And the further away you get from that Middle East marker, then the less value there is to the crude. So when you find some crudes like Mayan, Mexico Mayan, that's a very low API, it may be $10 a barrel less than West Texas. And you get others that hit a sweet spot. Maybe they're a 38 and the Middle East is getting a little heavier around 29, but if they can blend that 38 with the 29, they get a really nice mix, 38. So you'll start to see, and the only thing we're trying to bring out is if you go out and you look up oil prices, you'll find out all sorts of different oil prices at different parts of the world at different times. And it all has to do with A, the API gravity, B, the sweetness or sour, and C, what refinery is it going to? That'll really dictate a lot on the value.
Oil, natural gas also is looked at on sulfur content, but then also it's looked at dry gas or wet gas. And that's because what we talked about with the organic compounds and how oil and gas deposits are formed. You have some deposits that are primarily gas, that's going to be dry gas, and you have some formations that have oil and gas, and that's going to be called wet gas. And again, when we're talking about fiscal policy, if you have a policy in a market that is for oil only, but there are gas in those reservoirs that's being produced as the oil's being produced, the oil companies in their economics have to determine what are we going to do with this gas. And there are some options environmentally and technology-wise of what to do with that. There's also the option of utilizing that gas to power your operations. Yes, ma'am.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
We just had a quick question. How much would it cost to build a refinery in Alaska versus how much would it cost to ship our oil out of Alaska? That's from online.
Well, I think that the second question is answered by the fees that you can go look up that are being charged to actually tanker the current oil out of LDs to West Coast refineries. And those numbers vary with time. They vary with the price of oil. I mean, because it's the fuel to fuel the tanker to get it to market. The cost of a refinery, I haven't got a clue and wouldn't want to venture one. It would just be expensive. It's in the billions, yes.
I also had a question about the sweet and sour. Do you have any numbers on that for like the North Slope, Cook Inlet, and then like Middle Earth, which is like the Nenana Basin area? So like what is the API up on the North Slope?
I
We
actually
have that actually on this slide. We placed it there because we've gotten that
You-
question before.
About
So
32, yeah.
we'll get over, we'll get to that when we get to this slide. So this is the blended number for the ANS West Coast price. So I don't have the exact numbers on those regions, how they differ, but the blended number for ANS West Coast is 32. I think the API is 32 point, around 32.1, 32.5, something like that. And on the sulfur content, it is just shy of 1. Where were we? Here? And Cody, did you have a question or a comment?
It tells you all you need to know about the costs,
Great.
at least in the US.
Thank you. Lauren, I have a question. The people online, can they only hear when questions have the microphone? Okay, so whenever we have a question or a comment, just hang tight for the microphone to get to you, so the people online can hear our discussion in the room. And the bottom point is kind of like thrown in there as a last thought, but it's actually something really important. And I was born in a gas field in Liberal, Kansas. So people ask where I'm from, and I say Texas very proudly. But in international immigration, I say Liberal, Kansas. And they're like, what is that? It's a gas field. And so Rich actually knows the information sort of all over the US of the different their markets and the narrow range that you have to get this gas to for those markets to be able to safely have their consumers use that. So for that to go into power gen and household use.
Yeah, what most people don't know is your furnaces, your gas ranges, and literally any other gas burner is set up to burn a certain quality of gas. And if that quality changes much, it's a recipe for disaster and explosion. So for example, everything from Denver all the way to about Ohio was all served by this Hugoton field in Kansas. And it has gas that's just at almost a pure methane content, which is around 920 BTUs per cubic foot. So think of that. So every furnace, every gas burner, everything was set up to burn 920 BTU per cubic foot gas. Now we have new fields, Eastern Colorado, Julesburg Basin, comes in at 1,200 BTUs per cubic foot. If they were to put that directly in a pipe and into some of those burners, the flame would bounce off, it would reset, boom, explosion. So what did we do in the Julesburg Basin? I worked there as well. It's kind of my second stop. We had nitrogen injection plants. We had to take that 1,200, inject nitrogen to dilute it down to the 920 to 950 range that all the equipment in that area was based on. But if you go to the East Coast US, it's for a much higher BTU per cubic foot. They can't burn the stuff from the mid-continent. So a little bit like oil can only go to certain refineries based on its API gravity. Gas has to be watched very clearly when it goes to different markets. That's almost why you should, if you've ever been transferred corporately, they tell you you can't transfer and bring a gas range with you. You can't bring any gas-fired equipment with you because the specifications are different in each part of the country.
And, we're taking time with some of these anecdotes and kind of getting into the nitty gritty because it's important to see that here in the state, largely, in Juneau, let's say, and here in Anchorage, we're talking about fiscal policy, but what is actually the reality of what's happening? And why can we not just look outside and say, well, compare ourselves to there? Well, all these things we just talked about and all these differences and the costs that fall on the consumers, and is the infrastructure there? And what does it cost to producers to produce? And in the state, when you guys talk about, having taps, well, and we talk about the flow rate in taps, and we'll get there. Why does it matter that the more barrels, the less the cost is? Not the less the cost is, but the lower the barrels go, the more the cost is to keep taps, warm enough and to keep everything moving and to lower the wax buildup and everything else that's happening. So we're trying to provide some color so that you can see happening out there, physically in operations. and what's being considered by those that are working in, you know, the different aspects of the value chain of what happens when it comes out of the ground. There's a whole nother world that's being considered. Okay, so we talked about all the different deposits that are created. And, you know, if you talk about Canada, you hear a lot about heavy oil and tar sands and what they have up there. You talk about Texas and North Dakota, and you're looking at the unconventional oil and gas wells. That's where you're talking about the fracking. And when we talk about reservoirs here, we're really talking about the, you know, the big conventional oil fields. Something that's pretty cool is when we look at this drilling here that kicks and then turns into lateral drilling. You know, when I worked at an oil field services company, part of the research and the technology we were developing is that you could go down, you know, tens of thousands of feet. You could make a turn and you could hit a formation that's 12 inches wide. And the technology today, I mean, for lack of a better word, is that these tools can see. So when all of the work is done to technically understand a formation underground, you can say that's our spot. That's our spot that we want to hit and we want to develop. And you develop your entire well plan off of that. And it's very cool just how far down and how far out drilling can go. So if you ever get an opportunity from any of the oil and gas companies up here to see any of their technology or demonstrations or, you know, any of their videos, anything like that, it's very. And Alaska is unique in the fact that, you know, you guys are Arctic and different things. So your technology here is I'm kind of being a nerd about it, but is even cooler in Alaska.
Let me just add a little more color. So there's two things with what we call the lateral type drilling. Is one is you can use it to reach something that's a long ways away. For example, they talked about Liberty at one time of drilling from onshore where it's 1/10 the cost to drill. And, you know, by putting a land-based rig and then drilling this extended reach clear out to where the reservoir was. So sometimes it's just getting the straw into the reservoir so that way I can produce. But that's really this sort of horizontal directional drilling that opened up shale. Let me give you, you know, if there's any true reservoir engineers in here, I'm going to apologize to them right now because I'm going to really bastardize up reservoir engineering a bit. But when you look to see how much oil you think you're going to get out of a reservoir, there's all this complicated formula and it's got one variable which is called, and that's the height. So when I was in Liberal, Kansas, we would drill wells. And the way I would make sure my depths were right is there was a shale that always gave me a gas kick, but it was only 20 feet thick. And if you put a pipe in it and we tried to produce it, nothing much came out of it. It wouldn't be commercial. H was 20. Okay. What happens if you are able to turn the corner and drill a mile worth of pipe in that reservoir? H is now 280, or it's 260 times more H. So now all of a sudden, I've contacted more reservoir, more height in that reservoir, and now I can economically produce it. That the amount of gas that comes out of it is like if I drilled vertically through a mile-high reservoir, only I've kind of turned it on its end horizontally. So if you want to know a lot of why this goes in there is, so I drill horizontally to get more H. And then in a very simplistic fashion, again, the reservoir engineers will get me, what a frac job is goes into a city that's got nothing but one lane streets and everybody trying to get out and puts in 18 lane wide superhighways. So all that gas and that oil can flow very quickly to the well bore and back out the well. So you're just creating larger roadways with the frac, and you're creating much more H by going horizontal. And the combination of those two takes something that in my whole early career, we could not figure out a way to produce that shale, gas or oil, and produce it economically. With the advancement of technology over the years, that has become the new wave of oil and gas that we've seen across the US and the world.
Any questions there? Questions, comments? Okay, so everything we're talking about here, we are not moving slides. Oh, there we go. Everything that we're talking about, we want to keep roping it back in. Why are we talking about it? Why is it important to fiscal policy? So, for example, we talked about reservoirs that may just be oil or may have associated gas. In a fiscal policy, you have to determine, are we treating oil and gas the same or are we treating them differently? And when we look at that, in some cases, in some reservoirs, that may be more cut and dry, that may be easier. In other reservoirs where you have the associated gas, when we look at it from an operational level, that may be something very difficult for oil and gas companies to separate and say which costs go with oil and which costs go with gas. And as you know, in fiscal policy, cost is a major component structurally. So on the operational level, when we consider fiscal policy and we consider how is this going to go forward, this is why we talk about this. So we talked about the different types of formations, the conventional and unconventional, oil and gas. We all know about shale. So why is this important in project economics and why is this important in fiscal policy? So the first curve, this gray one, I'm not sure if it's hard for you guys to see. We're going to call that a shale oil decline curve. And the money moves with the decline. So obviously, as production is going up, you're getting more revenue and more cost. And then as production comes down, your revenue is declining with that production curve. So as you can see with the shale well, it shoots up and it stays up there for a second and it falls right off. So there's a term that is loosely used called factory drilling. And that's why if you look in fields that are being developed with this kind of with shale wells, you'll see that they, in a portfolio and in a field design, development design, you'll see that it goes boom, 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 boom. And you get a bunch of these points that all just hit one after another because that's how you maintain the economics of the development, because it sits up there at that revenue point for such a short amount of time that you have to drill many wells after each other in quick form. Now,
In a lot of the shale wells, you can expect, sometimes to produce 80% of what you're ultimately going to produce in the first couple of years. So tie that back to what we had on the third or fourth slide, where one of the biggest factors on oil company investment that governments need to think about is time. And you can see with the shale well, time is short. And what we know is when time is short, that's good.
mm-hmm.
And when time is long, that has other considerations.
Mm-hmm. And these wells will produce for a long time. They just produce at a very low level. So, for example, when I was young in the industry and I had a lot of friends that were petroleum engineers, they would get sent out to East Texas to babysit these wells when they were in this phase because they were young engineers and they weren't going to trust them in this phase. So they sent them out there in the middle of nowhere to learn how to babysit the well and to learn about the wells and the geology and everything else. So let's contrast that with a conventional well curve, and you'll see that this one specifically, it has a pretty quick ramp up. It does not go as high, but the decline is much less steep. So that well is producing a lot more for a lot longer. But back to what Rich said, your economics here are very different because you are not recovering all of your costs as quickly, and you're not turning a profit as quickly. So whereas a shale well is going to hit that point farther this way, shorter amount of time, conventional wells are going to hit it farther out. So when I talked about that example in the beginning, you're making a $50,000 investment. Do you get that money back plus a profit in 1 year or maybe 10 years? And what does that profit look like? The type of deposit, the type of reservoir that you have that producers are able to work on here in the state, by nature, you can't control that. So what you can control is the fiscal policy side. You can't control this part. Anything else you want to say here?
No, just you had conventional gases generally because of all the infrastructure you have to put in for gas, from the gas processing plant to the pipelines to markets. You tend to develop gas fields more at a certain rate for a long period of time. So it's a staged development over 2 to 3 decades for a lot of these gas fields.
Lauren, can we get the microphone for, do you have a question back there first?
I have a Quick question. What's the average cost for producing a barrel of shale oil now?
That varies.
And yeah, it can be funny and say how long is a piece of string. How much it costs to produce a shale oil well depends on where it's at. It depends on when it was drilled. It depends on what point in its production, where on that production curve it is, because when it's producing, let's say 100 barrels a day out of that well versus when it's producing 10, the costs are going to be very different. I think what we've seen is we've seen numbers all the way from $10 to $25 a barrel to produce a shale well. But again, that's not an average that goes for every shale well, because it all depends on where you're at on that curve and depends on where you're physically located.
Representative Galvin has a question. We'll just wait for the microphone.
What I will say, it's a lot less than producing a barrel of oil on the North Slope.
I had two questions. One is I just want to make sure I have your numbers on the axis right. So is that millions of barrels? What is the 20, 40, 60? And I assume the bottom is years. That's the first question. The second question is, do you have anything to help us understand the investment that oil companies are making and the timing of that as opposed to the timing of when we're seeing the output? So if we could understand how much investment is going in advance of this and during this, it might be an interesting perspective.
Sure. So we're going to go through project economics, which will cover that side of producer economics. And we're going to really dig into this aspect of time more. So Lauren, you had another question?
Yeah, what
Oh,
percent?
give me 1 second. The numbers, so on the left side, that's production, but it's really just an indicative number. It's just for the sake of making the curve. It doesn't actually mean anything, but yeah, on the bottom is time.
Yeah, I was trying to say, if a shale well relatively gets up to 100, if you were producing that as a conventional field, it might only get up to about 65% of that as a peak and have a different decline.
It's just representative. Yeah, it's indicative for the shape. Yes, ma'am.
What percentage of Alaska's production is shale?
Ooh. Do you know the answer to that?
I think it's negligible, if not zero. Yeah.
As shale oil became cheaper with technology, a lot of investment left Alaska for years and went down south.
Yeah.
So that's our competition.
Yeah, I think the comment that was made here is that, the shale, the technology and everything developed to the point where it was a whole lot easier to take that technology and that cost and go to New Mexico and Texas and North Dakota, Wyoming, et cetera, than to come up to the North Slope and do that.
Good. Okay, so this is a chart. So around the world, there are marker crudes, and that's regionally. And like we've talked about, all the different reasons that oil can be priced differently, API, sulfur level, but it's not just that. When you start talking about the market, it is also distance to market and how does it get from the well to the plant, to the refinery, to the consumer. And so these marker crudes around the world, reminder that none of these places can determine what kind of oil and gas they have. They were dealt those cards and they have designed a fiscal policy around that. They have attracted in based on what they have underground. And these marker crudes this pricing is what is used when it goes to market to trade and, when it's coming to consumers. So you can see how much, well, I guess this is not the marker crudes. We're going to get there, but you can see how much this differs on the scale of API gravity and how much this changes. So globally, we have things that sort of cover the whole scale and the market responds to that.
Higher, it's kind of contradictory. The higher API numbers are actually less viscous.
Mm-hmm.
So as you go to the left on the axis, you're getting more viscous, which is more difficult to
Thicker.
produce, more difficult to refine. You know. So it's kind of the scale. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Just wanted to point out that how that scale is kind of different than what you would normally think. It's backwards.
Mhm.
I don't know why they invented it that way, Rich.
I don't know why, but it,
Thank you.
he's right. We could have, instead of saying 20 to 50, we could have put peanut butter at 20 and put baby oil at 50. Put honey around 25 and applesauce around 35. I mean, that's the type of variation that you get in this crude. But also, besides that characteristic that has to be dealt with, is if you're down in the peanut butter range, you're going to produce a lot more of asphalt type product out of that crude oil. As you get up around the baby oil side, you're going to produce more jet fuel and kerosene and the like. So it not only changes where you can go with it, but it also changes the product mix. That's why refinery just can't overnight pick a different API crude that's very different than what it's used to and put it in there. Now, how important is this? Again, anecdote story. I worked a 2-year project. We wrote a program for the Kuwaitis because their fields were changing in the relative proportion and the mix of the crude that they were putting out. And they had all these contracts that had certain penalties for getting too far afield, either getting too high or too low on the API. So we actually helped build a program that optimized through automation of the oil wells, which wells produced when, so that way they can maximize the production and minimize the penalties for being off their crude. So that's how important it is. They have an entire facility there at their tanker loading area that is nothing but a giant crude blender that gets fed off of the wells out in the field. So that's how much work goes into managing the API gravity of crude oil. I think we're at 10:15. Take a break. Can we take?
just have 2 slides till we
Oh.
get to the next section. So if we wrap those up, then we're at a good stopping point.
Okay, we'll have to go fast.
Okay, and so just like oil, gas has marker hub pricing. And one difference is that globally you have sort of a more narrow range of fluctuation in oil. But the fluctuation in gas can be huge. So like today, that's very relevant because of the Russia-Ukraine situation and what that has done to the global movements of gas. Now we're seeing super high prices sort of in the Asian area and the issues that are forming in Europe. And this is just a quick slide to explain, I'm not sure how much we need to go into this, but to explain the units that oil and gas are measured in. This becomes important in fiscal policy because you want to look at, are things set off of strictly, in areas that have oil and gas? Is fiscal policy set strictly around volumes of oil, which is barrels per day in this case? Is it around MMCF of natural gas, or are you looking in fiscal policy at a blended volume of the two, and the way that you blend that is barrel of oil equivalent per day, and there's a parity between oil and gas. So there's a parity of how you say this much gas equals this much oil, and then you have a barrel of oil, really that is a volume of oil and gas. So in fiscal, what volume are you defining?
Yeah, and we just put up there, at one point you were talking about LNG being designed at 3.6 BCF a day. That's 600,000 barrels of oil equivalent. So to put that in context with the 500,000 barrels of oil that you're producing out the North Slope. So it's contextually about the same. Now, since we have that on an energy parity basis, we said, well, on a price parity basis, that means $6 a barrel is the same as $1 per MMBTU. So at $80 oil right now, plus or minus, you'd say, well, the price parity on gas is 15. Well, if in Europe, that's what it is. You're in Japan, that's what it is. If you're down on the Louisiana Gulf Coast, it's $2.50. So natural gas right now is selling at a huge discount to crude oil on a heat value basis as we go forward. And that's again something that as you look at the amount of gas that you have, it's what market you go into with it and what you might do with it. is to understand how this parity works in the various markets around the globe.
Okay, do we have any questions before we take a break? Nope. Do you guys want 5 minutes? Do you want 10 minutes? I don't know if you need phone call and email break or if you just need water and a snack. Okay, let's do a 5-minute break. It's 10:20 and let's scoot back at
Let's-
10:25.
10:30.
Oh, Rich would like 10 minutes, so we
10:30.
will do 10:30.
Make sure you turn the mic off. Okay, can we have everybody come in and start sitting down? We'll get you to lunch on time. Keep going. Where do you want me to do this? All right, we're gonna start back up here and keep going.
Oil and gas prep thing. I don't actually have to listen. I just kind of, because Julia's listening.
We're having some good
What's
online
that, oil and
feedback.
gas?
Definitely want to mute.
Okay. We don't want to listen to that. We're bringing, okay, now everything we keep doing, and I just want to reemphasize, we're bringing up a lot of tidbits. We're not diving in real deep right now. We're bringing up a lot of tidbits, but it's just mainly so that way you'll know all the things you need to think about as you put your policies together, as you put your laws and your regulations. So this one is very simple. You heard Christina use a couple times value chain. And that's just how we say the value chain is how we go from the oil in the ground to the oil and gas and electricity and whatnot that you consume every day. And the industry is generally broken up into upstream, midstream, and downstream. You'll see that the companies organize themselves that way. They'll even talk about that within their annual reports on the public companies. And generally the upstream is everything to get the oil and the gas out of the ground. The midstream is the simple processing and movement. And then the downstream is how do I refine it into the final products that I use and get it distributed to the consumer. The important things from petroleum policy is, first of all, you have to decide in your policy where that line is between upstream and midstream. And jurisdictions do it differently. In your case, you've decided that TAPS is midstream, not part of the upstream. It's in the upstream calculation, but it's not part of the upstream legislation and regulation. In some countries, the equivalent of TAPS would be part of the upstream. It would be part of the upstream mathematics on cost and the upstream mathematics on taxation as you go through it. So that's one of the key things to keep in mind. But the breaks in there that we kind of got up here is most petroleum fiscal policies that you'll find around the globe only focus on the upstream. You can separate it out. That's because on a risk and reward basis and the amount of capital that goes into it and what I call what's known and what's not known, the highest risk is always on the upstream. So that tends to have its own package put together. Generally, by the time you get to the midstream, okay, I've got a pipe. It can move 2 million barrels a day. It's going to have this much going down and it's going to have this tariff. It's very well defined, a lot less risk, not without risk, but it's able to go forward. Lauren? We have a question.
We have a question online from Representative Sumner. He says, I don't understand why BASF is moving operations to China instead of US with gas prices that low.
I wish I knew, but I'm not familiar with their move or why they're doing it. But I just don't have any background on that I can offer. But it's a good question. Why is the industry moving out as we go forward? Because the one thing we do have is the energy to move forward. But the big thing that we'll get into when we get into the order of operations tomorrow, when we do dive into what you've actually got set up, is even though you're not, quote, regulating midstream and downstream in a way, it comes into your regulations and your laws. For example, the downstream where the oil gets sold to let's take North Slope oil getting sold to the refinery. Who's selling it? Is it the North Slope operator or is it one of their affiliates? And then who are they selling it to? Is they selling it to one of their own affiliates? So we get into this whole world of, is it a transaction or not? If there aren't enough transactions going on in that spot, how do we know whether that transaction is market or not? You know, you got 1 million widgets being sold by 50 different sellers and bought by 50 different buyers. Pretty much can say I've got a market. I know what market price is, and that's what I can use in my calculation. When you've got 3 sellers, 3 buyers, and 3 intermediaries, you know, what constitute a market? You've got to have a way to be able to do that, because that price feeds all the way back into your calculation then for what you're going to tax. So a lot of what we have up here, you'll have the segregation between upstream, midstream, and downstream, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to be smart or kind of smart about midstream and downstream. You just have to be careful that you look at that and make sure you properly manage how that flows into your calculation for value back to the well or back to the lease or unit, and then therefore how that value feeds into your tax regime. We have 3 players. I call this sort of the perfect 3-legged stool. You know how stable 3-legged stools are. And you got governments, you've got the primary large oil companies, and you got service companies. And the reason I put service companies in here is it's a source of information for you, is round about the mid-1990s. Prior to that time, had the biggest research centers everywhere. If it had to do with even bit technology and how to drill and all the logging technology, I name it, it was the different chemicals to use and how to get more oil out of the reservoir. That was almost all paid for and run by big oil. But then we had the price crash. We had oil go down. I don't know if you remember, it went down to under $10 a barrel. And one of the first things they did is they shed all that. Well, who picked it up? Well, it's now Schlumberger, it's Halliburton, it's Baker Hughes, and it's a myriad of other small service companies are the ones that have developed the advancements in seismic and drilling and logging and the rest. So I put them up there because you really got to bring them into the equation. They are third parties to the oil companies, but they're a very integral part of what you need to do. And sometimes I suggest that a good discussion with the service industry can be as valuable as a good discussion with the producing industry to find out what's going on, what's there. Usually what we have in these 3 players, just quickly, the governments, they usually own the resources, but they don't have the people, the time, or the money to develop them. So then they turn themselves over to the energy companies because they have all those things. They have the technology, they have the know-how, they've got the people, and they bring all that to it. And as there's a term that we've exhausted the easy oil, that what we have now is more difficult. We're having to drill a lot deeper, which means much higher temperatures and pressures, which has all of its own impacts on oil and gas development. Or we have really large projects to develop and bring on. One thing that the energy companies are very good, and they've trained a lot of people on, is large project management. They have the processes in place in order to be able to go forward and do that.
Before we move on, something on the government side that's an important distinction. Globally, in many countries have their own oil and gas company. So, for example, when I said I worked down in Colombia for Ecopetrol is the national oil company of Colombia. So anyone who operates down there contractually is also operating with, or at the time, contractually also operating with Ecopetrol in some sort of form or fashion. So when we talk about competition and we're saying, let's look externally, if we look at a market like Norway and we say, let's look at their system, they're Arctic and this and that and the other, and they have some similarities to Alaska. Well, a whole other similarity that makes their fiscal policy not replicable is that Norway has national oil companies, and that is package in their fiscal policy. So it's not something that we see in the United States. There's not Texas Oil and Gas, company, or Alaska Oil and Gas Company. But it is something we see globally. So that's something to remember when you're saying, I want to look at competition, competitiveness around the world. That is a factor that completely changes structure of policy.
And then last, we have the service companies that right now they're the ones that bring the equipment, they bring the people to actually get most of it done. And a very interesting thing, which we'll talk about when we get into different structures out there, is something that's emerged in sort of a big way in the recent last decade is a service contract. So a lot of the governments have said, well, by golly, if the service companies are the ones bringing everybody, they're the ones that are on site, they're the ones that have the technology, they're the ones that are developing new things. Why don't we just get the service company to come be our partner and take older fields and see how much more oil they can extract out of them? And you might say, well, why would governments do that? Well, if you look historically, big oil, the expected return on their money, the return on their investment, is generally about 6 to 7% greater than the service company. So think about that. A service company that's used to getting 10 to 11% return, I call them like the supermarket of the oil business. They don't make a great profit, but they have a lot of volume. Okay. But you contrast that with the producing companies. They're doing the exploration. They're doing a lot of the upfront stuff, the seismic, the whatnot, all these things that don't always get recovered on a field. Well, they have to find a way to make the money to continue to do that. That's why when they do produce, they have a much higher expectation on the return that they're going to get, because they're trying to get a return for their whole business, not just for that one project or field at the time. So these are different ways that some governments are looking at that when they have very mature fields, some of them are really turning to the service industry to develop those until abandonment and not through the oil company. So it just gives you an alternative out there. Okay. Competing in the global industry, I was kind of egotistically, you might call it, chuffed when I was here in May and I toured a number of offices, and I went into the office of one of the legislators, and they were excited to show me everything that they had followed up from the previous training, where they went to all these different sites, signed up for daily newsletters, and were actually getting information about the oil business around the globe in the lower 48, what was going on. And they found that it was free, didn't have to pay a consultant to come do it. It was timely. And if they need be, they could look up what they wanted, or they could write to the people and ask if they had any articles on it, was able to get stuff. This is what I would highly recommend that you guys do. If there's nothing else you take away from this, if you want to know more about oil and gas, go to a number of these different sites, go to the number of different providers, all the big consulting companies, all the big firms, law firms. I mean, I get the daily briefing from 4 different law firms on energy issues. And so they're looking at it not just from the standpoint of what's the changing trends or technology, but what's the latest on court cases and interpretation of what governments can and can't do, oil companies can and can't do. So all of these, I'm going to go over them, but all of those are great sources, much like that Schlumberger dictionary about oil field terms. If you're really wanting to know more, get yourself signed up for any number of these. And if you need help or suggestions on 1 or 2 that might be best, hit us up afterwards and we can give you what to look at. But there's a wealth of information out there. Now, I'm going to put one caveat on it. Make sure you don't misread it and misinterpret. And this is where I have to tell you a story. Because there's a member of your legislature who 5 years ago swore I'd never work in this state again. And it's because we had a bit of a disagreement. I put up a slide on what the terms were in Texas. They confronted me with a report that they had read in the Society of Petroleum Engineers, a very well-renowned publication. My data was from deals we were actually consulting on at the time. It was real-time data. His was from a publication that was dated 6 months prior. And if you know the SPE process, it takes over a year to go from a paper through the multiple editing process to get published. And in fact, if he had looked at the date on the graph that he was pulling off of, it was 2 years ago. Remember what Christina put up there? What's the only constant in the oil patch? change. So we were having a disagreement where he thought I was becoming some sort of shill for one side or the other because I was using real-time data and he was using 2-year-old data, but he didn't know it was 2-year-old data. Never paid attention. So I just ask you that when you do go to these sites and when they do quote or they do have plots, they are really good about putting up there where this data came from and how old or how recent it is. And to keep that in mind as you use it, so that way you don't get yourself in a position of having to say, you know, you got it all wrong, or you're changing your mind, or you're doing whatever. No, that's not it. So I think Elise brought this up about volatile prices. So here's the other thing that you get to deal with is volatile pricing in the industry. Now you say, we got it in the bottom line is what we call the price or money of the day. And then the top line is relative to a reference point, and then using the value, time value money across to show what it is. But if you look at that long stretch, 1900 all the way through the 1970s, where oil was very flat, around $3, $4, $5 a barrel. That's because oil was controlled by governments. The price was controlled. Once we opened up to the market, that's when you start to get the volatility coming in. So here's another short lesson that we don't have on the slide, but I'm going to go over, is up until that point in time, almost all fiscal systems recognized that they were built off a government setting a price. And so all they had to worry about was the upstream and what the government was setting the price. The market paid the upstream price plus the cost of transport and processing and delivery. Today, we are 180 degrees. Why don't you put that thinking on? Prices are set in the market, and we subtract to get to the upstream value. And so your fiscal system, you know, there'll be a lot of comparisons. Well, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the whatever. Well, if it was in the 60s and the 70s, even gas in the US was controlled by the government. The pricing was set. So it was real easy to be an upstream regulator because you just work off of whatever the government had set and you played off of that. That all changed in the 80s. And now it's all market, what we call market net back, meaning we net off the cost from the market price to get my price in the upstream. So again, we said it a little bit before, now, and we'll say it again later. You don't have to regulate the midstream and downstream, but you need to have a cursory understanding of how it works and how things are happening, because that will impact then ultimately the value of the products that come off the slope or the inlet, and then how your taxation works on it.
And this is something tying back to fiscal policy that we'll look at more in the later sessions. But there's a mindset of what can we as a state control and what can we not control. And we covered some of that with what you have underground. You can't control that. You also, the state doesn't have control of what the price is. So when we think of fiscal policy design, we have to think that the future can look like any of those scenarios that you just saw in that price curve. And does our system withstand that? And is our system successful at these varied price ranges?
Okay. Again, these are just some curves that you can pull off of this. Energy Institute used to be the BP. Yeah, BP used to publish an excellent statistical review of all the data you'd ever want on oil and gas in countries. It's now the Energy Institute. But we put these plots in here just to show that over time, you can see the movements from one region to the next. You know, let's face it, the U.S. has gone to a few wars or have gotten themselves involved in some major disagreements, they're not always called wars, to protect its supply of energy. And so as you can see, either here, you know, the growing supply coming out of these various areas. You can also look at these curves off of that data on demand and where the demand's coming in and how that's growing or not growing in different regions. You'll find, as they call the dragon and the tiger, between China and India have been having massive growth in their energy usage. you'll start to see the changing geopolitics that you get involved in. And you're part of this global market, so that you're going to be impacted by it. Sometimes it may be only a minor impact, other times it may be quite a major impact. So we just put this in here as an example, but you can see how this thing comes on, though, that the North America here, you can see the impact now from 2010 going forward of really the shale drilling in the lower 48, that we went from a significant importing country to exporting crude. Yes. Back one.
Of that North American volume, how much is US versus Mexico versus Canada on that slide? And I guess the follow-up is, we know that a big uptick for the US in that time period is our shale. Was that also true for Canada? And is Mexico doing any shale, or is theirs all still traditional drilling?
So right here, you see right around the 2010, it's about 12 million barrels a day for North America. And we're now up here at about 21. So that's a 9 million barrel a day change. I do know that the US is about 7 of that, going from roughly 5 to 12. The other two, I can't tell you how that's distributed between Mexico and Canada. But the majority of that is the United States lower 48. I'm not aware of how much shale production is coming out of Canada. I'm sorry about that.
And doesn't Russia have a stake in the market from online?
Included in the yellow line, the CIS, it's Russia plus some Caspian regions.
Yeah.
And if someone wants to know that exact breakdown, we have the associated data. It's part of those data sources that Rich put up, but we can direct people there if they actually want to see year over year the different breakdowns of those regions and the countries that make them up.
And again, I apologize. We didn't come to be experts on the regions, but this was more an intent to show you the type of data that's available and the type of data that you may want to take a look at as you're trying to formulate your policies. This next one is what I find the more interesting. Yes, there's stuff going up and down, and I can read about that, and I can see where money's being invested. But this one shows you the movement with the supply countries or supply regions on the left and the market regions on the right. This starts to set up a lot of what I call the geopolitical connections. And you can find and see the dependencies. Middle East, which was mainly used to be the US and the Middle East, you see now the biggest connection on the Middle East is China. And so you'll see a lot more courting the Middle East countries into many things that are China involved. But you can go down the list, Canada, US, et cetera, down the left, and you can go down the right and you can see where those crude flows are going.
Said before, this is the Energy Institute that has taken over this report, but it used to be called the BP Statistical Review. And you can look at all of their old data. They were doing that report since the 70s. So it used to be like a funny little, 5-page report, and then it more recently turned into robust data and charts and everything. But you can actually look at these movements year on year, and you can compare and say, okay, when this was going on in the 1980s, or when this was going on, in 2002, and all these different geopolitical things that we know were happening, or just when population booms happen, and when the BRIC countries, have come on the map as huge populations, and that are growing consumers. You can see all these movements in that resource.
And also, when you look up something of this, it generates questions. So what's the first thing that I saw when I looked at this? US line to China. When did we start exporting crude to China? Well, then I curiously look it up. Well, we sold out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to China. And so this captured that movement, because I was really surprised to see US crude going to China, but it did. And so if nothing else, if you got some questions and you're wondering why is this country doing this when they're a major producer, or why is this country, which is a major consumer, why do they have this new hookup? You can come to a diagram like this and you can just start to see and get a feel for where things are going. Now, if you plot this up in 2012, let's say 10 years ago, and then in 2020, look at the differences. It'll give you a good idea of where interdependencies are being set up and how those interdependencies then influence the fiscal in each of those countries, either as the receiving country or as the producing country. So, again, this was not meant to spend a lot of time, but this just shows you where natural gas has been changing over the years and the amount of production. And you'll see the great increase from both the North America, the former Soviet, and includes Russia. And then you've got Middle East gas has really ramped up. That is the major LNG that you've got coming out of predominantly Qatar, going into the Asia countries. And you see that when you come over here, you say, okay, where's all that gas going? Because Middle East was not ever known as a major gas producer. It was an oil producer, but now it is a major gas producer. Oh, and by the way, the size of the blocks is relative volumes, just to let you know why one block's bigger than the other one. It's the relative volumes. So again, you can come in here and you can see if we did this 10 years ago, Australia, which is number 2 on the left, would barely show up on the graph. But it has had significant gas developments, had significant LNG development, and now you can see those flow patterns as it comes into play. So again, nothing specific for Alaska to take away from this, but this is just showing you that was LNG movements. This is pipeline movements, and of course, almost everything out of Canada comes into the U.S., but some of the U.S. ends up into Mexico. So you can kind of see all these different movements in here.
And specific to Alaska is, there's been the ongoing discussion about the LNG project and about a gas line here. And if there's talk of LNG in Alaska, this is your competitive field, and somewhere your supply has to fit into this matrix. And yes, there's growing consumption, so this matrix, based on projections, is set, to grow in capacity, but you have to fit somewhere here.
Yeah.
And if, these as well, we have a second one, here on pipeline. If you look at this chart from a year ago and then you compare it to, a 2024 chart, let's say, you're going to see the effect of what's gone on between Russia and Ukraine, and the fact that Russia, is not supplying Europe, and that supply has to come from somewhere else. That's a big shakeup that you'll see in these graphs.
Okay. Christina?
This comes from the IEA, which is International Energy Association or Administration. And they, I put this up here because when you go to their website and they have this trending topics section, right? If we look at these, tracking clean energy process, okay, clean energy, when we came up here in 2017 and, started teaching this course. Global energy transitions, that wouldn't have been there. Oil market report, it would have been there. Hydrogen, Russia's war on Ukraine wouldn't have been there. Saving energy wouldn't have been there. Net zero emissions, people were kind of talking about it maybe. And global energy crisis. So up here today in 2023 would not have been here in and maybe even look different, in 2020. So we're talking about fiscal policy. We're talking about planning for the future. The pathways Rich talked about, the global volatility and pricing, the energy transition. These are all huge headwinds right now that the state needs to consider and needs to consider in fiscal policy, needs to consider in your pathway forward. And just like these things have continually changed, this is sort of a new normal now. This is the new business environment that the state is operating in that previously didn't exist. So to look to the past or to look outside and say, how do we do this? There's not an answer because we haven't been here before. So we haven't been here before because climate change now is the new driver, and climate change has not, in this forefront of a manner, has not been the driver in the energy industry before. Like Rich said, I think, learned very young in the industry. I remember I went to an American Petroleum Institute lunch and learn in Houston, and the president guy at the time was there, and he was talking about all the investments that the energy companies were putting into renewable energy sources. And this would have been probably 2008, something like this. So this is 15 years ago. And I remember thinking at the time, like, man, they're planning for all of this and no one's even talking about it. Nobody even knows. And they were the leaders in development back then, because we know that energy companies have been here for decades. They're going to be here for decades more. And just like we are saying to the state, hey, look for your different pathways, that's what energy companies have been doing for decades in their boardrooms and in their planning. So climate change being the new driver, what's different now is that this is public discussion. This is, you can call it ideology. You can say that the federal government has a bigger role in what's happening in the Alaska oil and gas industry than they ever have before. Opening and closing federal lands, all the different acts and things that are passing through the government right now and have been in the last few years is impacting what you are able to do here in the state. So again, when we talk about what can you control and what can you not control, how much influence does the state have on what's happening at the federal level, and how much do you just have to react to it and be prepared for those things? Rich talked a bit about this third bullet point, that the opposition to the industry right now is not, I think a few years ago, people used to go after the oil and gas companies and the environmental issues. But what's happening now today is people are going after the hand that feeds them, so to speak. So where the financing is coming from, where underwriters are, underwriting projects that issue that they are also combating that they didn't combat before. And like we talked about, a fiscal policy is two parties. And I know that probably the state and oil companies don't look at each other like partners, but you both are trying to produce a resource. You're both going for the same goal. And so when these issues are attacking producers and making it more difficult for producers to operate here, that is also attacking the state and the state's revenue. Those are one and the same.
I just want to highlight a point off that very bottom bullet point that's on there. Is there was an IEA report that said, 2020, 2021, 2022, we still need half of our electricity and energy is still going to come from fossil fuels, even in 2050. There's still the drive to net zero. There's still the drive to sustainable renewables, but there was a bit of a number in there. Well, I noticed they just published a very, very recent report in the last week that said, I think that number is a whole lot less than 50%. And you say, well, how did they get there? They got there by saying, oh, we're going to develop by 2035 160 terawatts of battery storage. So I started looking. I looked up how much does a Tesla Powerwall, what everybody's putting in their house. How many Powerwalls was that? 27 million Powerwalls. Now, we're going to advance battery development. It's getting better every year. They're going to decide how to build bigger ones. But I tried to put it into current context. 27 million Tesla Powerwalls will have to be built. Then they have to be distributed to the right places on the grid, because, the solar panels go where it's sunny, but the majority of our end use is where it's not sunny. And so you got to put all that in. It would take 400 years to manufacture that many Powerwalls based on the current Powerwall plants that we have today. So I want you to, you can be on either side of this equation, but as a state, you really need to understand how quickly is oil and gas going away. And so you have to read everything critically. The state of California mandated electric vehicles, took a lot of heat. So Stanford and Caltech put out a great report. Again, read the footnote. It said, this works because by 2030, we believe industry will develop recyclable batteries and rechargeable batteries. They'll be renewed, and that will cut the cost. It'll cut the emissions. It'll, you know, all these headwinds to having a full take-up of electric vehicles will be solved because technology is going to catch up and it's going to deliver what we need. But if we look at what we have today, it can't get there. California can't get there. So again, I'm just bringing this up that you need to look at these various, and there'll be different opinions in these various reports. EIA and IEA, two different, you know, same letter acronyms, but they're different, two different entities. One's in the US, one's in France. You know, we'll put out information on the same thing and you'll see slightly different conclusions drawn by them. Read them, find out exactly why they're different and why they're changing. But it's these predictions of the future is what Alaska needs to concern itself about. Because whatever happened in the past is the past. We all know we're in a period of great change when it comes to how we're going to handle energy moving forward. And that means great possible change coming for Alaska. And then how do you design for that? How do you prepare for that? You know, how do you put your systems and your policies together to be able to handle that going forward?
Okay, we really dove into this a bit early when we were talking about the prevalence of oil and gas in places where, you know, it's not necessarily obvious. And we talked about how power gen and transport are the obvious ones, and then we have all these other sectors that it's not as obvious. And so I think right now, you know, you have two things that are happening at a very high level in power gen and in transportation and at federal levels and global, you know, environmental initiatives. You have plans that are being put in place and you have research that's happening. And then at a very low level, you have consumers that are making changes in their own homes. You know, maybe you don't use plastic grocery bags and you use a concentrate for cleaner and add your own water and reuse the same glass bottle for 3 years. You're not using, you know, the Lysol and the Windex and the 15 bottles every 2 months in your house. I think that we are making changes in our homes, and this level's happening on top, but there is not huge talk and huge momentum that we know about for all of these in between things. And we know that that research is going on. I mean, Rich told you on his Alaska informal focus groups, he met a guy whose business is in artificial joints. And what he told Rich is if something comes out of the federal government or who knows where that there's an abrupt stop to fossil fuel or hydrocarbon production and use, his business is gone. Because in his business in artificial joints, there is no alternative. It all comes from petroleum byproducts. So
and metal.
And metal. And so there are things like that that they're important in our daily life, and we don't have a solution there. So what does this mean for the pace of transition? I mean, Representative Galvin, you asked what is our confidence level in what it is that we're presenting. And some of those sources that Rich talked about, the EIA, the IEA, all of those, they actually have monthly, quarterly, and annual, you know, projections and reports. Well, they'll tell you if, you know, they'll run scenarios. EIA, for example, some of the reports have 3 scenarios, some have 5, and they'll call this one, you know, expedited transit, you know, energy transition, and this one is slow energy transition, and then a few other things, and they'll tell you what does this look like going forward. And going forward, while we do have an increase of renewable sources, there is still a robust demand for oil and gas in all of these scenarios. And this is kind of more of the same, but I like to use this slide because this discussion like right into us and right into our home. So if I look around the room, there's multiple people wearing glasses. So glasses in their production use byproducts of petroleum. And probably there's some people in the room that I can't tell you're wearing contacts. Same thing. We don't have replacements for that. So what happens to sight around the globe for people that need corrective lenses? So you can look at this list, and I'm sure some of it is more important than others. And there's some things like toothpaste where you say, yeah, but we have alternatives for that. Yes, we do. That's on the list of things we have alternatives for. I have a tooth powder. So yeah, but this is our daily life. And so when we're reading articles and when we're seeing what's happening with the energy transition, like take a deep breath, because there is a whole level of things that we can't get this from solar power. We can't get this, from wind turbines. We can't get this from hydropower. These things come from petroleum. All right. Microphone, please. Thank
Question.
you.
So these non-traditional petroleum products, are they coming out of certain refineries? So just like, certain crude can go to certain refineries, are there certain crudes that produce the bulk of the non-traditional petroleum products, the medical devices, or are they still made from a mix of all the crudes out there? So, yeah.
Do you have the barrel picture? Oh, we took the barrel picture out. I'm sorry. We used to have a picture of a barrel, and it tells you what comes out of a barrel of oil. So if you look at the average refinery in the US, a 42-gallon barrel of oil, about 19 gallons of it is gasoline, 3 or 4 is diesel, 2 or 3 is jet fuel, and then you've got some asphaltenes, which is your roadways, and heavier, and then your lighter ends out of a refinery, plus what we call the liquids out of natural gas, the NGLs, can be converted into various number of petrochemicals. It's those petrochemicals that are then turned into everything from fiberglass to baby play school toys to containers to you name it. And on the medical side, an MRI machine with all of the plastic parts to it, that's all comes out of that petrochemical. It's just, call it the manufacturing of those things is just a further refinement of the oil and a further refinement of the natural gas into the products that we use every day. So every refinery is producing an amount that goes into the petrochemical business. Some, depending on the quality of the oil, produce more than others. And sometimes it's location that they may adjust their refinery to produce a little bit more of one thing versus another because there's a greater demand in that location and they're right there close to it. They can service it value. It depends. It's a small amount. To me, a lot of more of the petrochemicals come out of the natural gas, the NGL liquids. So your propane, ethane becomes the ethylene, the polyvinyl chloride. You go down the list. It's those things that come out of that. She's going to get mad at me now, but I'm going to tell another story. Is one of the things that I did on my tour is I had somebody who was adamant that he's from California. He had 3 electric vehicles in the garage, and damn oil, we don't need it. I said, so how are you going to drive your car? Because you're driving fossil fuel cars. And of course, after a while, he got a little perturbed at me and said, I do not drive fossil fuel cars. That's why I have 3 EVs. I said, oh, what are you using for tires? He said, rubber tires. I said, we don't make rubber tires in the US. All tires on vehicles are 70% fossil fuels. No way. Off to Google he went. Damn, it's 70%. I said, EVs weigh 20% more than a standard vehicle. They're going to wear the roads out more. So to help them out, they all have fiberglass parts and plastic parts, bumpers and whatnot. Guess what that's made out of? Fossil fuels. And then, of course, I already told you the wiring story. What's an electric vehicle full of? Wires. How are you going to insulate them? How are you going to make wire harnesses unless you have something that's a non-electric conducting material? It's all fossil fuels. The carpet is fossil fuels. Unless you got the Corinthian leather, the interior is fossil fuels. I said, so where is your non-fossil fuel vehicle? Because you certainly don't have one. And I bring that up because the average American doesn't know that. They believe that if they have an EV, they don't use fossil fuels. Couldn't be further than the truth. Can't wait till they put wooden wheels with metal straps on them to be the wheels on all those electric vehicles out there. Because that's the only way they're going to have an electric vehicle without fossil fuels. So now you have to start thinking through this. They say, oh, well, we'll recycle rubber. We'll recycle the old ones. Well, recycled rubber has a tendency to crumble. So you want to get just out of a pair of new tires that are made from recycled old tires? No, most of that recycled old tire goes into ground material around playgrounds and whatnot, or into, weather mats around houses, cars, rugs, etc., because the stuff is too soft now and again to use as a tire to get 50, 60,000 miles out of. So you have all these things happening. And I just, I bring it up because, when we talk, that's why I come to my conclusion that oil and gas is going to be around for a while. And whatever Alaska can do, I think, to continue to develop its oil and gas, continue to develop the revenue that it gets from it and put it into its permanent fund, so that way it does become permanent and not temporary. What you don't want is a temporary fund. You want a permanent fund, and they make it a permanent fund by funding it with enough that it can run your government and run your needs long after we get to the point where then oil and gas really starts to dwindle off.
Have you seen any data focused on this list and what the impact of this list is on global warming? What percentage of global warming is due to fossil fuel use in cosmetics or life